The issue of the relationship between center and periphery far exceeds the cultural, economic, political issue that appears more directly linked to architectural problems, an issue that is barely the tip of an iceberg that penetrates deeply into historical reality. At present, the loss of the value of the center as a foundation, the sliding of the center toward the margins, and as a consequence, the margins' acquisition of a particular central condition could be considered the most characteristic features of this relationship. At the risk of committing the sin that some philosophers attribute to architects, that is, the sin of dealing with philosophical concepts at a superficial level of analogies rather than their true meanings, I would like to make some references to philosophical orientations concerning the subject at hand, which can contribute to its more profound understanding, and for which I will mainly follow the exposition of Gianni Vattimo. Vattimo examines the concept of nihilism derived from the philosophies of Nietzsche and Heidegger, who point out the coincidence of the crisis of humanism with the abandonment of the center on the part of being. Being dissolves its presence-absence into the network offered by a society increasingly transformed into an extremely sensitive organism of communication. Nihilism is the situation in which man rolls from the center towards X. According to Nietzsche, the root of this nihilism lies in the loss of foundations, the emphasis on the superfluity of the highest value, which ultimately represents the death of God. To this loss of centrality of being and to the abandonment of fundamental values, the usual reaction is one which makes a grandiose metaphysical appeal to other, truer values. For example, the values of subcultures or popular cultures as opposed to dominant cultures, the rejection of literary or artistic canons. The great processes of destruction of artistic, architectural and urban models carried out so far this century, first by the historical avant-gardes and then by the critical movement against modernism in architecture and urbanism, would find their framework in these statements. A similar shift is also produced in art. According to Yves Mouchot, a large number of the most influential manifestations of contemporary art may consist precisely in the fact of shifting towards the center, which usually remains at its margins. But art itself, according to Heidegger, would also have a decorative and marginal essence. Its role would consist of creating a background rather than a strong subject, since it has become the object of a distracted perception. I will add here another process of weakening of the center which concerns the urban. Indeed, most of the world's large cities have been suffering for several decades from a process of decentering, a theme that some deconstructivist architects recognize as characteristic of their architecture. The major communal functions of the city, those that gave each city its particular character, are dispersed. They abandon the center, creating a diversity of sub-centers or centers on the margin, which, for the same reason, cease to be strictly margins and themselves become centers, albeit weak centers because they no longer embody the overall sense of the city, the being of the city. It could be said then, paraphrasing the philosophical statements cited, that the being of the city leaves the center and heads to X. This is not the place to elucidate the causes of such displacements, in which a transformation that reaches the most diverse structures of urban society is present. I will limit myself to mentioning it as one element of the general decentralization we are examining. Now, this apparently apprehensible process, which can be related to postmodern society, is surely more complex and ambiguous than what is presented here. it is enough to consider the operation of centralization of the margins that Jorge Luis Borges carried out in the 1920s at the dawn of modernism. There was then a peripheral avant-garde in Buenos Aires, which drove the poetic structures of modernity, moving the margin to the center of the Argentine cultural system, as Beatriz Sarlo explains in analyzing the poetic movements of the 1920s and 1930s. In Borges' case, she points out the ability to raise the margins to the level of universality. It is also worth remembering here that, even in 1929, José Ortega y Gasset devalued the notion of the center by asserting that Europeans considering themselves to be the center of the world is a sign of provincialism. In any case, in the present period, this situation of decentralization seems to have been assumed in a more general way, and thus from the marginal end of the center-margin relationship. It is up to us to decipher the counterparts of the center's loss of strength. First and foremost, the consequent acquisition of some centrality by the margins is weak centrality, because it is not universally valid and because its foundations are historical and existential, that is, changing and perishable. But it is centrality nonetheless. It is also noted that the crisis of the models of the center have given rise to pluralism, has put an end to the cultural monopoly of the great countries of the West, and has thus sanctioned the legitimization of various local projects, including the decentralization of modeling, a possibility not always taken advantage of by local actors. As the center maintained its strength, the peoples of Latin America necessarily appeared as marginal in architecture's cultural production system. An undeclared but accepted scale of values placed, and to a large extent still places, the productions of certain countries considered central on the highest plane, a scale that is affirmed and prolonged thanks to the discipline-like attitude assumed by the majority of Latin American producers. But the displacements are beginning to be reflected in architectural production in both the theoretical and practical fields. The process of raising awareness of cultural dependence on the part of formerly colonized peoples and the consequent affirmation of their own values have already been commented on. In the field of architecture, the instruments are being forged to explore reality in search of their own values. A few conspicuous examples point to possible orientations. The work of Hassan Fatih in Egypt, of B.V. Doshi or Charles Correa in India, or of the Latin Americans Rogelio Salmona, Severiano Porto, and Eladio Dieste, among others, ensures that there are possible and fruitful paths for such explorations. The difficulties faced are not few. In architectural cultures inserted in a tradition of discontinuities, ruptures, and the constant eruptions of foreign ideas in local development, it is not easy to define one's own identity. History has recently been resorted. A new and widespread attention for knowing one's own history has opened a way of reflection rarely found in this milieu, with the exception, of course, of historians. However, the passage from knowledge of history to the discovery of values that can be considered one's own, and then to the elaboration of guidelines for design based on these values, requires a series of conditions that go beyond research or theory and directly engage the quality and the craft of the designer. The present study aims precisely to highlight patterns of evaluation that can contribute to orienting architectural praxis towards the consolidation or elaboration of a regional identity. Despite all these shifts, the attraction of architectural production from central countries still predominates in local cultures, and it can perhaps be said that, to some extent, the reactions take place on the margins of the margins. The fact is that the center-margin relationship is marked in this era of hypercommunication not only by the conformation of the global system of production and consumption of goods, which has led certain sectors of both international and local communities to accept the passive role of consuming sophisticated products and of producing only the most basic ones, but also by the intrinsic power of information, more potent in terms of its weak status compared to systems of political or economic domination. Much more intensely than in the past, this circumstance places different cultures at the crossroad between universalism and localism, or regionalism, between the universal and the particular, between the need to move to the general rhythm of the world and, at the same time, to remain true to themselves. The great architectures of the past were by no means immune to the weight of the great universal movements and even of the most direct transculturalism. Gothic, Renaissance, and Mannerist architecture spread from well-defined centers to the most distant regions, acquiring their own characteristics, the product of assimilating to a way of doing or a way of seeing corresponding to their new local, and sometimes becoming symbolic expressions of the new nationality. Such was the case of the Gothic in England. The dissemination of ideologies, methods, procedures, images, and linguistic forms has always been an essential element of the historical fabric. However, the conditions of that dissemination have changed radically in the contemporary world, and so have the power relations between the world's nations. From the period when the masters of the Gothic carried their ways of making architecture from one country to another, to when the treatise writers disseminated the Renaissance or Mannerist models to the most distant countries, up to the present situation, the magnitude of the quantitative changes that have occurred in the process of cultural dissemination has produced a fundamental qualitative alteration. The acceleration of history and the changes in social life, in expectations, in ways of life, the multiplication and new reach of media, which have eliminated distances and cultural differences in terms of the reception of information, the mechanisms of consumer society, which encourage a constant renewal of objects and forms, decreeing obsolescence and proclaiming new values that in turn will fall under the law of consumption, have all resulted in the creative, positive, and enriching character of cultural dissemination. This is, however, often submerged under the negative aspects of a passive and superficial acceptance, by which new forms are superimposed on existing cultural forms without entering into close connection with them, but rather simply replicated them and interrupting their possible development. Another perverse effect of the power of information is the reductionism that operates in the transmission of architecture and ultimately in architecture itself. The media, with its magnificent graphic quality, reduces built architecture to a representation trimmed of all its context, two-dimensional, eloquent in the impact of its images, which are often constructed by a skilled photographer. Such a reductive operation assigns the appreciation of architecture to only one of the senses, that of sight, leaving aside its spatial, material, sound, and environmental richness. At the same time, this way of evaluating architecture has encouraged more than one professional to conceive of their work in photogenic terms, looking for effects that may be irrelevant in the built work, but that could enhance its presence in the printed page. This may be one of the causes of the conceptual impoverishment and constructive schematism of much of today's architecture. The imbalance that exists between the quality and quantity of information emitted and disseminated by the central and peripheral countries is also a perverse effect, causing disinformation rather than information. Lack of communication blocks the exchange of information between marginal countries, a blockade that developed for complex reasons, among them the persistence of a communication system typical of the colonial world, in which, after 2 centuries of political independence for Latin American countries, relations between the former colonies and colonizers continue to be privileged while the exchange among colonies is hindered. The information system thus serves to feed the mechanisms of consumption of information, and thus the consumption of languages, images, and ideas, supported by the periphery's acceptance of products endorsed by tradition, power, and prestige, and their counterpart. The disinterestedness of those who come from the world considered peripheral and lacking those attributes. However, I have already alluded to the movement that aspires to reverse this process, a movement that is gaining strength year after year. The conflict between universalism and localism, between adherence to the central models that appropriate for themselves the condition of universality and the formulation of specific models, seems to recognize the aforementioned relationship between reflection and praxis as the core of the problem. This relationship appears to be broken in the case of marginal countries. In effect, the rules and their insertion in a given physical and cultural reality are lost when systems are transferred to new mediums. Architectural ideologies, when they are transferred, instead of appearing as the result of complex debates around proposals and solutions, instead of exhibiting the polemic character between their ideas and achievements, are presented or received as closed systems, as great conceptual schemes of universal and definitive value. What's more, they lose their essential character as a step in a process, a theory, praxis, critique, reformulation of theory, and appear as a final and irrefutable phase of reflection. As long as an architectural theory remains open to dialogue with historical reality, it will continue to generate valid concepts and instruments to operate in that reality. But when that dialogue is broken, it becomes impotent, incapable of renewing itself or of acting productively in reality. Thus, these theories and ideologies that are transformed, at best, into more or less rigid conceptual schemes, or more frequently into a mere collection of images, enter a new reality that has certainly not participated in its elaboration. If this new medium has a more or less solid architectural tradition, the new ideas will probably be confronted with the body of concepts or existing modes of production. In this encounter, there will be an existing exchange, and orientations will be generated that verify the necessary balance between the movement of universal thought and the particularities of local culture. But if, as has happened in most of the countries peripheral to the centers of power, there is no tradition of architectural thought or a sufficiently grounded degree of self-consciousness, it is most likely that the transplanted system of ideas will remain alien to the local reality, that it will not be deeply incorporated, that is, it will not put down new roots. Its own alienated condition will, in turn, lead to a process of further alienation from the culture in which it imposes itself by the force of its prestige, the alienation between reflection and praxis, and the alienation between praxis and the cultural and social environment. Even the issues proposed for reflection frequently reappear without significant variations as the issues and modes of reflection from the country of origin. Praxis will often accept procedures or images coming from the reflection and praxis of others. Interiority loses an opportunity to consolidate or strengthen itself and is snatched away into pure exteriority. This being will also have left its center toward X. In this way, for Latin American countries, with its sometimes hesitant or insufficiently defined cultural consciousness and feeling of constituting the periphery in the Western world, the transfer of architectural ideologies becomes, all too often, one of the many processes of alienation that they suffer daily in the social, economic, or political fields. These questions, as expected, were noted in our countries before they were in Europe. However, for some time now, some international critics have been considering regionalism as a positive trend in architecture that reinforces or maintains regional identities and as a constructive opposition to various negative forms of universalism. The term regionalism, however, is extremely ambiguous because it can refer to positions that fluctuate between both local reinterpretation of international ideas and reactionary conservatism of a folkloric or populist nature. It seems therefore indispensable to pull out elements for a definition that makes an instrumental use of the term possible, removing it from the terrain of vaguely nostalgic aspirations. One aspect to be considered in this definition is the discussion of the terms in use, a topic that I will return to shortly. One of the elements that can effectively contribute to the formation of architecture in a regional sense is the analysis of the role and character of technology and its relationship with the concept of modernity. In fact, it seems accepted that architecture's degree of progress or modernity should be measured in its access to advanced technology, the so-called high-tech. In a recent interview, Oriol Boigues argued that it is not a question of basing one's identity on underdevelopment or poverty, but on the struggle to achieve the technology of development. Now, what should be understood in our countries by advanced technology? The graceful and monumental constructions of Norman Foster or of Helmut Jahn, the fabulous domes of Buckminster Fuller, the subtle skin of Cesar Pelli or of Kevin Roche, the strength of the ideas and propaganda of the developed world, based on the ideology of modernity, has led us to take for granted that the only path to progress is the one that these countries followed, accepting that concept of progress as fact. We try to follow it, each time getting farther and farther away, even after its disastrous sequences for the stability of the world have become evident. Therefore, defining what advanced technology means for our countries seems urgent. In a first approximation, it could be said that advanced technology is that which allows, based on human resources and available materials and through its improvement and development, the achievement of the highest degree of productivity to attain a habitat suitable for each region and way of life, both in quality and quality. It can be said that all materials are universal, both modern and ancient, but each of them, from brick to concrete, from wood to steel, has qualities and conditions in its production processes and in its process of use that make it more suitable in different places. In Argentina, for example, the regional imbalance means that a technology acceptable for Buenos Aires becomes a caricature when used in semi-rural areas, and vice versa, that the transplantation of rural technologies and images is incoherent and anachronistic in the urban environment of the metropolis. As for the development of highly technical systems, this requires both a stable foreign policy and a strong internal market with permanent action, both conditions that are usual in only a few of our countries. The use of regional resources does not imply stagnation or backwardness. Among others, this is brilliantly proved by Eladio Dieste, Rogelio Salmone, and Togo Diaz, as well as Severiano Porto, creator of an architecture of great value based on wood technology. The investigation of the qualities of regional materials, their adaptability to current needs, their response to environmental conditions, and the existence of a workforce with the capacity to develop and adapt to the necessary technical advances is one of the aspects to be emphasized in this search for regional identity. So far, I have used the term center periphery and center margins without examination. However, these terms are loaded with connotations that require careful debate. In the first place, the center-periphery pair of concepts entails the idea of dependence, because both terms belong to a system in which the second is subordinate to the first, occupying a secondary and accessory place. Everything that is produced in the periphery will be done within the framework of decisions made by the center. In the periphery, only second-degree decisions will be possible, which is to say, decisions taken within the framework created by the first-degree decision-making bodies. The models provided by the center will form the basis of all peripheral development, and in cases where these models cannot be reproduced, at least the image of the center model will be preserved as much as possible to indulge the picture provided by the center. The acceptance of such a condition would require, on the one hand, that the condition responds effectively to a historically specific situation, and on the other, that it be decided to renounce any possibility of developing an architecture appropriate to the region. As for the former, historical examination of Latin American architecture reveals that this has not been the type of relationship between colonizers and colonies in all periods. Ramon Gutierrez has pointed out that the complex origin of the Spanish models of Latin American colonial architecture reveals some unprecedented combinations in the center country, a new product distilled from memories, procedures, and images, in turn modified to adapt it to their new domains with their different technological possibilities and different urban or rural environments, so that the final result can hardly be inscribed in a model reproduction relationship. In our century, the diversity of sources and the indiscriminate arrival of information make it generally difficult to recognize the possible models that have been the object of syncretic operations, almost never of literal repetitions. Perhaps it was only during the period of eclecticism and academism that a direct relationship between the center and periphery could be detected, even though free and fanciful interpretations of the central models abounded, with the importation of plans, materials, technology, and craftsmen. This unequal relationship throughout history would suggest that architecture has represented more than once the possibility of eluding the total weight of the central power and minimizing the relationship of dependence. Regarding the second point, that is, the possibility of developing an architecture specific to the region, it should be borne in mind that the center-periphery system establishes a scale of values of the center, which will serve to categorize both central and marginal products. Thus, everything that is done or not done, everything that is thought of or not thought, will necessarily be read according to what is done or thought in the center. The producer from the periphery will be judged, in the best of cases, as a gifted student, at worst, as an ignorant person incapable of understanding the subtleties of central production. But more often, he will simply be ignored, the most derogatory mode of categorization, known, although not always acknowledged, only in his closest environment. I have previously commented on how the organization of historical material by central historiography inescapably places Latin American production out of the context. The value system apt for understanding the central architecture is not apt for understanding the peripheral, but no alternative system has been created for that purpose. In this way, by introducing the production of these countries into the center-periphery system, the same fallacy is committed when one historical period is judged in terms of the values of another. The concept of periphery thus implies a lack of knowledge of each culture's intrinsic centrality within respect to itself, a weak centrality perhaps, as has been said, but necessary if one intends to reach an understanding of its production and character. These considerations regarding the term periphery are valid without major changes for the term margin. Both mark positions subordinate to a center, with an extrinsic ownership that does not give them the right to participate or allow them the freedom to define their own development. From these reflections, it seems necessary to replace the term periphery and margin with something more appropriate, both to the historical situation and to the projects for the future. Therefore, the concept of region tends to replace those mentioned in recent studies. For the idea of region, unlike that of the periphery, locates its culture in a system that is based precisely on the plurality of regions, a system in which none of them exercises hegemony and cannot therefore be held up as a model of universal validity. In this system, the loss of the center that the philosophers cited above and the evaluation of marginal cultures in the absence of central values are evident. The totalitarian idea of high culture is replaced, therefore, by that of cultural pluralism. The judgments about advantages and disadvantages that each culture presents in the various fields may enter into other systems, that of demography, climatology, agricultural or industrial production, within which they may be categorized according to their respective advantages or disadvantages. But they will not be value judgments that qualify or globally disqualify one regional culture over another. In this system, it is not necessary to replace the production of a region on the Procrustean bed, to be shaped by the guidelines of the central countries until it qualifies. Instead, judgment is directed towards its own center, and in doing so, values can be distinguished that perhaps had not been discovered along with these values that had been confused in their deeper meaning. The substitution of the concepts of periphery or margin by that of the region, the radical displacement of the point of view, almost a Copernican revolution, has allowed architects, critics, and historians to direct a fresh, more constructive and original look into their own history, relocating episodes in a new historiography, as well as a look into an architectural praxis, laying the foundation of a theory. The regionalist approach can thus be accepted as a way of understanding the local circumstances in its most diverse aspects, ways of life, building traditions and technologies old and recent, urban images, typologies, without implying a limit within a narrow localism or freezing historical development, but as a way of consolidating and building a cultural world based on one's own model. This centralization of cultures previously considered marginal can be interpreted in different ways. Kenneth Frampton, who has contributed greatly to bringing the issue to the table for international debate, sees it as a possibility of resistance to the apparatus of the post-industrial world, as a way of maintaining a vital nucleus without allowing oneself to be absorbed by the apparatus. I, for one, prefer to interpret it as a divergence within the general direction of postmodern culture, as an attempt to find alternative paths to those marked by global society. The first would be a, so to speak, static interpretation. It is a matter of conserving something, of entrenching oneself in the face of the invasion of an undesirable system. It is a somewhat romantic or nostalgic position. The second, on the contrary, is a dynamic interpretation. It aims to express a project. Given the restrictions that the apparatus of postmodernity presents to peripheral peoples in order to approach the central models, this line is abandoned in search of more appropriate and possible models for the fulfillment of their historical trajectory. To resist is to preserve a situation, to create an enclave within the system so as not to be absorbed by it. But for how long? To diverge is to leave the system, to put aside its structures, to embark in unknown directions. To resist is to remain so as to defend what one is. To diverge is to develop, to break from what you are and enable what you can become. Probably, the difference between these two interpretations comes from the difference in origin of their supporters. From the center, the margins cannot be seen as generators of projects, but only perhaps as refuge. From the margins, everything is, or should be, a project.